Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone around the world, wherever you are located. Welcome to the Salesforce.com API series. This is the first of many webinars that we'll be holding where we're specifically going to talk about how you can integrate applications with Force.com. Before we get started, I just wanted to ensure that anything that we discuss today is under our safe harbor statement. Please ensure that you make purchasing and design decisions based on information and products that are publicly available. Without further ado, just quick introductions. My name is Sohail Sikora, and I work for Salesforce.com Services. Been with the company coming up on 7 years now. Was an architect and developer prior to that, and today I also do the same work. I'm an architect and lead a team of architects here in the East. And with me, I have Vasu Bhandarkar. I'm going to turn it over to him so he can introduce himself to the community today. Vasu.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Vasu Bhandarkar. I'm a technical architect with Salesforce Services based on the East Coast. I've been with Salesforce for about 2 years, and I've worked on many different projects with integration and technical architecture and design. Currently, I serve as a program architect for one of our large enterprise customers here on the East Coast.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Vasu. Vasu and I are going to get started today with some basic building blocks and take you through a journey, but we hope that you join us through this journey of a series of API webinars on all of the social platforms that we are active on. Both Vasu and I are on Twitter as well, and feel free to reach out to us and ask questions on any of the other forums that you see here. Quickly, we do have an expert support team today. Just wanted to give them a huge shout out at the beginning of the call, and if you have any questions, please feel free to bring them up on the webinar chat, and we will answer. The expert team will try to answer as many as they can. At the same time, we'll also pick a few questions which we think will benefit the rest of the community and actually answer them towards the end during our Q&A session. A quick rundown of the agenda. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes here to go over some of the things we wanted to talk about. Want to spend a few minutes up front talking about two things. Really why people need to integrate Force.com with other applications, or why anyone feels the need to do it. And then how can you go about doing it, right? What is your strategy? What are the things that you need to look out for? And then we'll get into some of the common building blocks. These building blocks are common to all of our API. So anything that you do with Salesforce, and we certainly don't plan on covering the multitude of APIs we offer today, and that's why it's a series, and this is the first. Then we'll get into some of the specifics around our SOAP API and the REST API that we offer, and provide you with some access to resources before getting into Q&A. So to get started, I like to bring this slide up and talk about the what and why. From the time enterprise applications have become common, we've always had situations where there isn't really one platform or one application that can do everything that an enterprise needs to. Over time, application platforms have evolved into best of breed. So people use, let's say, an SAP for an ERP system. They use Oracle Financials. They use Salesforce for a CRM and Service Cloud and call centers. And you might have custom applications that do different things, which none of these platforms can necessarily play in, where you write it using Java or .NET. And these are typically on-premise applications that run behind your firewall. And there's always been a need to either get data from these systems into Salesforce or to get data from Salesforce into these systems. So that's typically the use case. With time and the popularity of public, private, hybrid, and other cloud-based systems, we are also seeing an uptick in the number of consumers using tools such as Concur or Workday, or building custom apps on Heroku, Amazon, Facebook pages, and so on. So there's always this need to do cloud-to-cloud integration, right? So how can your Salesforce platform talk to your other applications that run on these other clouds? And then finally, last but not the least, the demand from our user communities, right? Everyone who works certainly for Salesforce or for all the employees of the customers that I have worked implementing Salesforce for, and Vasu has, the employees want access to their data and to their information in a timely manner on different devices, on different platforms that have different profiles. The most common ones we see obviously are the ubiquitous iPhone, the iPad, Android-based devices, Blackberries, and so on, Windows Phone now with the new Windows 8 platform. So there's always been a need to have integration between the apps running on these devices and the Salesforce API. So we like to bucket these needs into these three large categories. And what we've seen is having a thorough understanding of our API allows you to pick the right integration endpoint or the right API for the right use case. But before you get to that point, how do you go about that process, right? When I first started talking, I mentioned the need for a strategy. I think this is very important. Integration is something that is very rarely point-to-point or between two applications. While it may start off that way, it eventually evolves into many applications talking to many applications. And if you just put a box or boxes that signify each one of your applications and started drawing lines in between them, you would see that, at 5 or 6 or 7 applications, it gets fairly complex very quickly. At the same time, we have enterprises from the very large enterprises to the small, where some enterprises may only have 5 applications to integrate, while some enterprises have 500 applications that they need to integrate. So it basically varies widely depending upon the size and the complexity of the enterprise, but you cannot hope to solve a large complex problem like that without a strategy of how you're going to do it. So having a strategy is a very important part of this equation, right? The APIs are tools or the enablers, but really the process is how you go about deciding what is the right API to use and what are the right tools. And we like to look at this in 3 different steps. And just wanted to quickly talk about, the 3 steps that the way we like to approach this. First is really you want to define the process, right? By that, what you mean is, for a particular process, what is the data you need, right? What are the tasks that need to be carried out and the timeliness of them, right? Do you need to, for example, send some information from Salesforce at the very moment it gets saved? Or is it okay for you to send that information out of Salesforce every night? If there's something in SAP or Oracle Financials, do you want to send that information back into Salesforce immediately? Or do you want to send that every night? So the events that drive your integration choices, the data that it carries, and the timing of those events and the data's presence is basically the process. Once you define that, you want to find out where you want this integration to take place, right? Do you want it to be a UI-based integration where you do mashups? Do you want it to be application logic level integration? I use this in the morning session. It's actually a very good example. Tax calculation is a good example of application logic where you don't want to replicate your tax calculation engine in each and every application you build. You want to have one engine that calculates taxes for the entire enterprise. So given an amount, given a zip code or a location or jurisdiction, it returns back with how much taxes should be charged. So that's a good example of application logic. And then finally, the data model, right? If you have an account or a contact, or if you have a case or an asset, how much information do you need to store in Salesforce to make the end user's life easy and actually effective? And then how much information do you not really need? So you have to decide what data elements you want to bring versus what you don't want to bring. Once you identify the layer at which you want to do the integration, whether it's application integration or just data or it's at the UI level, now you know what processes you want to integrate. You also know how you want to, where you want to integrate them at what point. Now you decide, okay, how do I go about doing this, right? And that's where the approach is very important. The primary functions of the approach really are the classic build versus buy decision making. What I'd like to say here is integration is unique because no 2 applications are ever the same, no 2 customers are ever the same, no 2 groups and enterprises are ever the same. But at the same time, the basic tenets of integration, which is transferring information from one application to another with some rules applied, that doesn't really change, right? It's the same no matter what your integration is. There are so many tools out there that very rarely does it make sense for you to build everything from scratch. So I would say look at connectors, look at existing integration tools, look at existing middleware platforms. Select something that will do 80 to 90% of everything you need it to do. Most enterprise customers have already made the choice. They already have, robust platforms. Use the platforms that you've invested in, and then spend the rest of the time, the 10% that you cannot get directly from your platform, spend the time on building it out, right? And if you do have to do that to extend your platform and build it out, the 10%, that's where the other two become very important. You want to have a methodology for building these out so you're successful, and then you need to have the right type of resources. So whether it is going to a systems integrator and hiring someone who has the experience, or whether it is training your existing staff, in using integration tools, which is more common than you would think, right? It's just a personal story. I used to be a developer, and I had a chance to learn an integration technology on a project of mine. And then I started specializing in doing enterprise application integration, and that became my niche. So that's how people develop over time. But I think it's very important to have the right resources to get your integrations in order. So you've identified the strategy, you know all the things that you want to do, and now you're ready to embark on your integration project with Salesforce. So what are some of the basic things that you have to understand? Some of the basics we like to look at, which are the building blocks, are: one, Salesforce supports your standard username, password, credential authentication mechanism. The core building block of any Salesforce API call is you need to authenticate a user, you need to get a session ID, and then you need to make a call using that particular session ID. We support secure socket layer, SSL. All of the traffic is encrypted between your servers, between your client apps, between Salesforce and Salesforce, so it's secure that way. And then for authorization itself, we support OAuth, where OAuth is the open standard for authorization, where once you are logged in and you are issued a session, that session, based on the OAuth scope, will tell you what you can do. So for example, can you just see your chatter feed, or can you create records in a certain object, or can you only read information from a certain place? So there's different scopes that you can restrict, based on the API traffic that you want to. And then we also support custom token authorization mechanisms. Delegated authentication is a mechanism to authenticate a user that we've had even prior to Salesforce implementing SAML, and that's available today. And then you can do mix and match, right? We've typically seen that most customers will go for a hybrid model. Some certain mechanisms work well for application-to-application integration. Certain mechanisms work well for, let's say, a client to an application and client to Salesforce, like your mobile client, for example. So there are different mechanisms. Use the right one, and go ahead, authenticate, authorize, and then start using the API. Once you have the building blocks, once you have a session, once you have the basic connectivity worked out between Salesforce and your applications, you are now ready to get into the specifics, which is, how can I actually carry out this integration, right? What API should I call? What are the formats of the data exchange? What's next, basically, right? And here's where we want to get into some of the specifics. As I mentioned earlier today, this is one in a series of webinars where we'll be talking about our different APIs. Today, we're going to focus primarily on our inbound SOAP and inbound REST APIs. There's going to be other webinars where we'll talk about how you can make outbound calls from Salesforce to other systems. So that's coming down the pipe, and we have one more scheduled, and we have a few others that I'm working, with the various teams on putting together. Getting into SOAP. So what exactly is SOAP, right? Just to set the context a little bit, SOAP itself is a way to exchange data using web services where the data is structured. And what we mean by structure is it follows a certain format, and the fields are defined in a certain way. There's a contract that is defined that says, if I call you with the fields in a certain sequence with certain values in them, I expect a response with certain fields or certain data elements defined in a certain sequence with certain values in them. And at the same time, I also expect this to be in a structured data format. For example, SOAP is completely built on XML, which allows you to provide structure to the data. How do we define this contract, right? How do you know what to call on the Salesforce side? And if you call a particular API on our side, what will you get back in response? That's defined by the contract definition, which is WSDL, or colloquially known as WSDL by most integration developers. It's nothing but a language used to describe the interface, right? It's a language that describes the contract. How do we expose this information? We expose this information over HTTPS with a couple of different WSDLs. So we define a couple of different types of contracts to call our web service API. And the next step really is to figure out which contract should I use. So the two flavors that we typically support are the partner WSDL and the enterprise WSDL. And what is really the difference between the two? The enterprise WSDL is very, very specific to your org, to your Salesforce org. It has a definition of the objects and the fields and everything that you have created. It can any client or any call that you make using the enterprise WSDL can only be used against that one particular org. So the code that you write, let's say you wrote a custom integration in Java or .NET, right, or some other language using the enterprise WSDL, you can use that code only to call that one specific org. As opposed to that is our partner WSDL, which, as the name suggests, is used by our partners, such as our software vendors who create connectors to Salesforce. Some of the names that are famous in the market: Informatica, Boomi, Pervasive, MuleSoft. They use the partner WSDL to essentially create reusable connectors which can be used against any Salesforce org. Now one might ask, how would you do this? How would you know which fields are there? Which fields can you query? Which fields can a user pick? And that's where the last part comes, where it's because it is driven by the metadata and because it is so dynamic, the programmer really needs to write that connector in such a way that you can introspect the response. So for example, you would say, Salesforce, tell me what fields are on the account so I can provide a screen by which the user can then select those fields and query them. That part has to be written by the developer of the connector. Or if you choose to write your your custom integration, then you have to kind of define the names of the fields that you're going to use in your code. Now, the typical follow-up question to this that we get is, that's great, right? I'm an enterprise. I need to do integration with my Salesforce org. Which one should I use, right? If you use a pre-built connector, you're most likely going to use partner WSDL. But if you're going to write custom code, you have the choice of using partner or enterprise. Now, depending upon your need, you can pick either or, but purely from a reusability standpoint, and as an architect who likes to write code once and maybe have the option of using it in multiple situations, we always generally tend to prefer the partner WSDL simply because it's important from a reusability standpoint, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we have a different application we want to talk to. It does place the onus of setting up the fields and the data around the fields on the particular developer, but with all the tools available today in Java or .NET or other apps, where other programming languages where you can map data very quickly, it's something that I would strongly recommend that you consider using. Plus, there are some limitations with objects where you have a large number of custom fields. Some web service clients don't like more than a certain number in the methods that they generate and so on. So you definitely want to watch for that. So for example, you cannot have a method that sends more than, let's say, 200 to 300 parameters in one call, right? You want to ensure that you don't run into a situation like that, and the partner WSDL can kind of help you with some of that. So what we're going to do next really is we're going to go ahead and look at our SOAP API in action. And the operations that we are going to run today are, we're going to log into a Salesforce org and then query for some data and then create and update data that you will see live. And I'm going to go ahead and take a quick second here to transfer over the screen to my friend Vasu. So Vasu is going to walk us through the demo.
Hello, everyone, again. So what we're going to do here is actually do a quick demo of how to use a SOAP API using a Java application. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to decide which web services to use. Like Sohail mentioned, we have our enterprise WSDL and our partner WSDL. And you can go and look at all the WSDLs that we provide for all of our APIs in your org. So here I've logged into my org, and you go to setup, you go to develop, you go to API, and right here you can see links to create WSDLs for your org. You click on this and it will actually create your partner WSDL for you based on your org. So what I've done is actually I've taken this WSDL, I've downloaded, I've saved it, and then I've used a tool or a code library that Salesforce provides called the Web Services Connector. This is basically a set of classes and tools that will let you, for example, parse the WSDL and create a Java stubs, and also let you use our web services. It makes it easier to program web services in Java if you use this tool. I've downloaded both the Web Services Connector, I've downloaded the partner WSDL, and I've compiled a jar file with the partner stubs, Java stubs, right here. This is my Eclipse environment on my local desktop, so I'm going to use this to run my Java application and actually call into Salesforce, which is the org I just showed you. The first thing we're going to do for SOAP is we're actually going to do an authenticate. So if you see here, I have my SOAP class here, and I have a main, and in the main I create a new instance of this class, and I do an authenticate. In the authenticate, I'm using some of the classes provided by the Web Service Connector, and I'm going to use my username and my password to authenticate. However, if you're going to use the API, you also have to use the security token that we provide and append that to the password when you do the authentication. So right here is where I do the login, and I pass it my username, my password, and my token. And what I get back are two different things. I get back a login result, but in that I have a server URL and a session ID, and I'm going to print that, and that's pretty much all in this method. So let me go ahead and run this.
So Vasu, it's interesting. You're logging into Salesforce, but then you're printing out the server URL. Can you kind of walk the attendees through why we need a separate server URL? I mean, clearly you know which server you're going to, right? You logged into Salesforce.
Right. So one thing I forgot to mention earlier is before you do a login, you have to specify what endpoint you want to go to. By default, it goes to login.salesforce.com. If you're using a sandbox, you would go to test.salesforce.com. But this is a generic endpoint, and it's the same endpoint used by all of our customers. And as you know, Salesforce is multi-tenant, and all of our customers reside on the same infrastructure and the same hardware. For you to actually make a web service call where you're actually going to do something with it, you really have to go to your org-specific endpoint. And if you go to the main login.salesforce.com, at that point, Salesforce doesn't know what org you belong to and where to redirect your API call. So the way we do that is you go to login.salesforce.com with your credentials. Salesforce figures out who you are, what org you belong to, and then returns back to you your org-specific endpoint, which is what you use to do all subsequent API calls. So right here you can see, for example, I got a session ID. I logged in. I also got a server URL, and it looks a little different. It looks vasubi.dev ed, which is basically a vanity URL because I've turned on my domain. So if I come back here, you can see vasubi.dev ed mysalesforce.com, which is basically my Salesforce instance URL. The next step in this is actually to go and create and run a query. And I'll walk you through the method. So all I'm going to do here is actually construct a SOQL query where I'm going to select ID, name from account, and I'm going to pick the last 5 created. I'm going to use the same partner connection object I use, which has the server URL. I'm first going to authenticate, of course, and then I'm going to do the query. And then I'm going to get the results back and actually just print them out. Let me just run that. While it's churning, what I'm going to print is, the last 5 accounts that's visible to the logged in user. What that means is our API respects the permissions and all security settings of the logged in user. So for example, if this logged in user could only see 3 of these last 5 accounts, the query would only return 3. If, for example, the logged in user had a profile where you had field level settings and you couldn't see the name, maybe that's not a good example, but say you couldn't see a field, you're trying to query for that field in this SQL query, it will actually not return that field to you and return an error. The next step of this demo is actually to go and create some accounts. So again, here I'm going to first authenticate and then get a session ID, get the server URL, and then I'm actually going to create. And I'll walk you through the create code. So what I have here is basically a loop, and I'm going over 5 times that I'm creating object stubs, and I'm setting the type to account. And this is where the partner URL, the partner web services comes into play. I'm actually creating a generic S object, and I'm setting the type to account. If you are using the enterprise web services, you would actually get an object called account and the actual field name, then you could set that. But because you're using the partner, where you have to use introspection or you have to know the field names up front, all I'm doing is I'm actually setting the type of the object to account and setting the field name.
Now, this is interesting, Vasu. You're creating these 5 records in a loop. Walk us through why you're doing this in a loop. I mean, if I wanted to create 1,000 records at the same time, or if I wanted to create 1,000,000 records at the same time, can I put all of them in one array and then go ahead and create all these 1,000,000 records? Will Salesforce support that?
You could, but it won't scale. First of all, it would take forever to run. So the best practice that we recommend is that you do not create, you do not do a API call for every record you want to create. You sort of use something what we call a bulkify pattern, where you do them in bulk. So say, for example, you had 100 records, or say 1,000 records. You wanted to create 1,000 accounts you wanted to create. What you would do is you would create them in batches, and the max is 200. Say you create 5 batches of 200 records, and you issue 5 create commands. So in this case, I'm creating 5 test accounts, putting them in a list, and I'm actually going to issue 1 call for all those 5 accounts, and Salesforce is going to create all those 5 accounts at once and return you 5 result sets. On the second part, can this scale up to 1,000,000 records? Yeah, you could do 1,000,000, but it will take forever. A better way to do it is to use a bulk API, where we have a separate API for doing large data loads or large data volume API calls, where you can actually go and do something asynchronously, and you can do them in batches of 10,000 accounts or what have you.
Oh, excellent. So I'm assuming one of our later webinars will cover the bulk API?
Yes, it will.
Okay, great.
So I'm going to run the code, and as you can see, it created 5 test accounts, and I can just pull up one of these row IDs, object IDs, and go to my org, and here you go. This is one of the accounts I just created right now at 10:30 Pacific. The last part of this is to actually do an update. So how would you do an update? What I'm going to do here, and I'll walk you through the code. Again, first do the authenticate, get the session ID, the server URL, and then do the update using that session ID and the server URL. So in the update, I'm actually going to go and first run the query. And I'm going to pick the last 5 accounts I created, which is just right now, these accounts. And I'm actually going to go again in a loop. Again, I'm going to use a generic S object type because we're using the partner web services. Set the type, set the name. I'm actually going to append -- updated to the name. And I'm going to again issue 1 single update API call for all of those 5, or how many ever I got, but I'm only getting 5 because I have a limit 5 here. So let me run that. And it comes back and it says it's successfully updated. So let me go back and refresh this. And then you see it's updated. This actually concludes the SOAP part of the demo, and I'm going to transfer back to Sohail.
All right, thank you, Vasu. While we are going to go ahead and get this transferred over to me, I'm going to go ahead and quickly recap what we saw today. So what we saw essentially is We saw how you can log into Salesforce using the SOAP API and then create some basic, call some of the basic methods, which is query, create, and update. We have other methods like you can delete information, you can also merge records. Definitely, our API documentation is the single source of truth for that, and a very good place to go and read up more about this information. So what we're going to do right now is do a quick introduction to REST. REST is really not, it's more an architectural style of creating web services that can be called. There is a lot of information on the web that describes how REST was put together, but it first made its appearance in a thesis that was done by a scientist called Roy Fielding, and that was really the beginning of this particular architectural style or pattern. Also, we're going to hear a lot about JSON today as part of the REST API. For those of you who are not aware, JSON is basically a text-based data exchange format. It comes from JavaScript object notation, and as the name suggests, it has its beginnings in the world of JavaScript, where strings and arrays of strings are very commonly used for many things. This contrasts with SOAP, where SOAP primarily uses XML. So what does the Force.com REST API do? It can pretty much do everything that the SOAP API does, with a few variations. One, all of the security, the building blocks that we spoke of, the REST API supports all of them. It's the same data model, right? Nothing is changing. You can query for accounts, you can query for opportunities, you can create an account, create an opportunity. The one thing that we get this question very commonly from various customers and from different webinars is, when should I use SOAP, or when should I use REST? I'd like to say a good rule of thumb is when you know the two applications, when the two applications that are talking to each other need to know in advance what the contract is going to be, or you're dealing with larger amounts of data that need to be transferred in bulk or batch, and you're doing more B2B type integration, that's the time to use SOAP API, right? As opposed to REST, I don't know, Vasu, can you walk us through maybe a good example of the REST API and where you would actually recommend using REST?
Right. So the REST API is a lightweight API. I mean, it's a lightweight protocol. It doesn't have an envelope. It doesn't have a big header. And one of a very good use cases for the REST API is in mobile applications. So in a business-to-consumer world where you have a mobile application, you're logging into Salesforce using a mobile app. At that point, you can go to specific resources and just pull them down. And because you're over a mobile network, you really want it to be lightweight.
Excellent. And what we're really going to do next is we're going to show you the differences a little bit in how a REST call differs from a SOAP call. And Vasu is going to walk us through how we can get a session ID from Salesforce, how you can query data from Salesforce, and then the same thing that we did with SOAP, which is how you can create and update a record. So I'm going to go ahead and make Vasu the presenter and have him walk us through the demos that he put together.
Okay, great. So similar to what we did with the SOAP, we're going to do the same query, create, and update, but we're going to use the REST API. Also, one more thing is for the authentication piece, we're going to use OAuth. To set up OAuth, what you first have to do is create a connected app inside Salesforce. And I can show you, I've already done the connected app, and I can show you what it looks like. So here you can see a connected app that's set up, and it gives your client a consumer key or a client ID and a client secret. And you can also set the OAuth scopes in terms of what profiles have what access, and etc. So I'm going to use this connected app to actually connect my Java application running on my desktop to Salesforce using OAuth. So again, here I have a class, a small demo class using the REST API, and the very first thing in the main is to get an access token, which is basically a session ID in some ways, using a client ID for the connected app, the client secret. You pass in the username, the password, and also your security token. In the method itself, for the access token, what you have to do is that you have to first use HTTP you have to use the endpoint. So I'm actually going to create an HTTP post request to this specific endpoint, similar to the SOAP API, which goes to login.salesforce.com services OAuth to token, and I'm going to actually pass it, all my parameters of the client ID, client secret, username. Actually do the post, the HTTP post, which will give you back a response, which is a JSON response, which is a JavaScript object notation response. And from that, I'm going to retrieve my access token and my instance URL. So let me go ahead and run that. Like you see here, I did the post and I got a response, and the response is a JSON object. And from that, I'm pulling out the access token, which looks like that, and the instance URL. Very similar to the SOAP API, you actually post the OAuth authentication post to a generic URL called login.salesforce.com, and that will return back to you your specific instance URL for all subsequent, which is your base URL for all your REST resources. The next part of this demo is to do the query. Again, I'm first going to get the access token, and then I'm going to use the access token and then do a query. In the query itself, I take my base URL and I actually append to it the REST resource, and then I'm going to append to it a URL parameter Q with the actual query. And then I'm going to do an HTTP GET, which is the way to do queries in using REST. Right here, we go ahead and add the access token we got, from the authentication, and then we do the execute, which will give you back a response. I'm just going to print the response. And I should get back the same 5 objects I created from the SOAP API. So make sure it's saved, and I run it. As you can see, I just ran the query using the HTTP GET. I got an access token, the instance URL, and I got a response.
Now, Vasu, you spoke to us about the SOAP API only showing the records that I would have access to. What about the rest? Does that work similar to that, or can I see all the data in the org? No,
it's the same. It's the same concept. So again, the REST API honors all permissions and privileges that the user has that you're using to log in or to authenticate. So it's the same concept. If you don't have access to a resource, you will not get that resource. I'm just going to take that response, and I'm actually going to do a pretty print for JSON. And you can see that I actually got 5, and this is the accounts I got, the SOAP demo account, and I actually went and updated all of them in the SOAP demo. The next part of the demo is to actually create an object. We create a brand new object. Again, I need to first, authenticate, because I'm not storing the token anywhere, and I'm going to use that token and actually do a create. So in the create, this time it's the same concept. To use the instance URL and the REST resource. In this case, it's services data version 28 S-object account, which is the actual resource for the account object. And I'm actually going to create a JSON object which has the name field and the actual name. I'm going to pass this JSON object as an entity to the HTTP request, which is of the type post. And I'm also going to add the access token for the authorization. And then I'm going to execute the post. I'm going to get a response.
Now, Vasu, I can see that you created an account, but you only created one account at a time. What if I want to create 100 accounts or 5 accounts like the one you created in SOAP? Is REST, not a good fit for that? And, where would, you mentioned mobile. Is that why this is this way? Like, what's exactly the story here?
Right. So our REST API does not support bulk operations except for the querying, if you think that's bulk. But all of the REST, the REST resources that we provide allow operations on only one record at a time. So if you had like 5 objects, you would have to actually go and create 5 different REST calls for each object that you want to create. You can use the SOAP if you have 5. If you have hundreds of thousands and millions, you would go to the bulk. So we provide different APIs for different use cases. In a mobile case, more often than not, you are not creating hundreds of accounts or hundreds of opportunities or activities. You're creating one activity that you're working on, for example. So it's a very good use case for using REST, because more often than not, you're operating on one particular record. The last step of this demo is to actually do an update. So, and let me show you that I created this object. So if I go and pick that, and I go to my org, and I put the object ID, you can see I created a REST demo account. I'm going to take this object and I'm going to update it via REST. So here in my main, again, I comment out that. I change this to this new ID I just created, and that's an update. In the update method itself, here we are. Similar concept, you authenticate, you get the access token, get the instance URL, and append to that your actual REST resource, which is the same. And here I'm going to again pass a JSON object with the name and the new value of the name field, which is updated. I'm going to use an HTTP patch, which is what is used for updating records via REST. I'm going to add the token, add the object to it, and execute, and actually going to print a response. I'm going to run it. As you can see, it ran, and I got a 204, which basically says it ran with no errors. And if I refresh this, you should see it's updated. This concludes our REST demo.
All right. So quickly to recap, Vasu just showed us today, how you can log in using REST, how you can create and query, create, and update data. And I'm going to go ahead and switch over back to myself. All right. So where do we go from here? As we spoke about this earlier, there's a whole build versus buy decision that you need to make. And the way we tend to look at this is, if 80 to 90% of the functionality that you need from your middleware platform can be done by a product in the market, certainly you should spend the time and the effort to acquire the right product for you. By no means are we endorsing any particular product, but there's multiple examples of things like Informatica, Pervasive, Boomi, Cast Iron, MuleSoft, to name a few. If you've already invested in a product like WebMethods, which has a Salesforce connector, or IBM, or any other platform of your choice, by all means feel free to use the platform that you are comfortable with. But the key here being, try to do as much as you can with a platform that does the heavy lifting for you, and then do the building or save the building the custom integration code for the 5, 10, 15% that you cannot actually get from a prepackaged connector. Some of the key considerations that we wanted to walk away with, one, we have built-in and scalable, reliable integration. All of these APIs come to you out of the box based on your edition of Salesforce that you're using. There is an ability to build custom APIs, and what we are going to do is we're going to actually have different webinar sessions that talk about bulk API, how you can build custom APIs in Salesforce, and so on. But finally, last but not the least, use partner tools to lighten the load, because it's an important part of the discussion as part of your integration strategy. Some of the resources that we wanted to talk about, my favorite, obviously, being an architect, is the patterns and practices document, but we have the architect core resources and our help, which actually has a document that says which API should I use, right? It's got a great it's got the list of all our APIs and good examples of use cases where you should use SOAP and REST. And certainly on the App Exchange, please look for integration partners. And then there are recipes and also the Wikiforce documentation page where you can find all of our API documentation or links to our API documentation. A quick shout out to all the upcoming events. We are going to have an application lifecycle management code talk tomorrow, and then coming soon, the next webinar in this series, which is going to focus on the Service Cloud APIs, specific to the Service Cloud console and the toolkit and so on. And then we'll have the developer preview and a few others that talk about mobile and workflow and sandbox. We thrive on your feedback. It could be good. It could be, if you want to praise the organizers, if you thought we didn't do something very well, whatever. We want to hear from you because it's very crucial to the success of our programs, please go ahead and provide your feedback. If you have attended and today's session with your email address, you'll most likely get a link also to the survey. Please go ahead and do that. We've also shared with you some of our the force.com developer pages on different social platforms, and also Vasu and I are on Twitter. Please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions that we didn't get to. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is take a few moments here to do some Q&A. So what we're going to do is quickly look at some of the questions that have been asked and see which ones we can answer. This is a good question here. Someone is asking, what is the use of providing an enterprise WSDL if we really want to recommend partner WSDL? Now, if you do not need the reusability, or if you do not need to take the same code and then use it in a couple of different places, you can really use the enterprise WSDL. If as a developer you feel that your integrations will not change over time, or as a developer your tooling provides you a mechanism to use the fields that are strongly typed and it's better that way for you, then certainly you can use it. Vasu, do you have anything to add to?
Yeah, so one more reason you might use it is, say you have a tool that's actually consuming the enterprise WSDL, and the tool has a GUI where you can drag and drop fields. At that point, you need to know those fields up front. I'm just thinking of like some sort of a UI or a GUI field mapper.
Okay. No, I think that's a wonderful reason to use it. Certainly, there are many integration tools that are built that will allow you to do that. The next question that was, how do you handle storing the username and password in your code to keep them secure? I think that's a very good question. I would say if you were building a production-grade integration using a tool, most tools that have connectors will provide you a mechanism to store the username and password in an encrypted format. If you have to build something yourself, which is a custom integration, then most platforms will again provide you a way to store the password, especially in an encrypted format, and you should follow all standard precautions that you would in terms of keeping the username and password secure. I think that's a very good question, by the way, but it's no different from let's say building a .NET or a Java application and connecting to, let's say, JDBC or ODBC from your code, right? There's mechanisms out there that app servers provide, or if you're building a custom client application, there's mechanisms out there that will allow you to, keep these types of information in a secure format. So I think those are standard precautions that you ought to follow for any username and password type information. So can you recap the difference between SOAP and REST in very simple terms? That's an awesome question, by the way. It's a one that stumps the best of us. The simplest way I can think of is both SOAP and REST will allow you to do the work, right? SOAP is just a way of knowing in advance what the contract is and then having that contract available for everyone else to follow, whereas REST is more lightweight, right? And in many cases, you don't necessarily need to know the contract in advance, because with REST, you can essentially just parse the response and then figure out what data you're getting and do whatever you need to with that. So
an analogy I've heard is SOAP is like a letter and REST is like a postcard. So it's really that small. Also from a usage standpoint, SOAP is typically used in B2B environments where you're talking between systems and you have an established contract and you expect certain things and you want that contract honored, whereas REST is free form and you can just go query as you feel like.
All right. I think that also answers a little bit another question that we had here. Can you talk about the pros and cons of SOAP versus REST? Each of them have their specific uses, and I think it's incumbent upon us as architects or developers to basically figure out which one fits our particular use case and go ahead and use it for the right situation. Let's see, what other questions do we have? Can SOAP and REST APIs be used to connect two orgs and do operations? Which one would be better in this use case? We have had customers use the SOAP and REST API to have two orgs talk to each other. Is that something I would recommend as an architect? Most likely not, simply because with Apex, when you're doing some of these operations, the WSDLs and the calls can get pretty large, and that's not really the function of Apex, was not to necessarily use it for org-to-org communication. You might actually get better results using some kind of an integration tool or middleware to actually have the two orgs talk to each other, or you can go down the path of using some of our other technology like Salesforce to Salesforce, for example, which was designed to do that. Can we integrate Salesforce with SAP using SOAP API or REST API? Which is the best way to carry out Salesforce integration with SAP? The best way really is to first find yourself a middleware platform that can talk both to SAP and to Salesforce. That's really the key. Once you have that, you really want to count on the capabilities provided by your middleware platform to enable that interaction. Now, how you do that and what patterns you use are largely dependent on the type of information you want to integrate. So when we first started the discussion, we spoke of, what if I want to send opportunity information after the opportunity is closed, I want to send it to my SAP orders. That's a very good example of using something called outbound messaging, which we'll discuss as part of a later webinar. But you need to find a middleware platform that can actually help you do outbound messaging, right? Now, in some cases, you might want to have SAP push some data out to Salesforce. SAP can then, create whatever it needs for an IDOC, put it on some kind of a queuing mechanism, have your integration platform pick it up, and then translate it into this appropriate Salesforce API call, and then write that data into Salesforce. So there is never really one way. I like to think of integration as a recipe. That's, from the personal note, I'm a foodie by choice, and that's something I like to tinker around with over the weekend. Integration is like a recipe, right? Everyone has different flavors for the same dish. Multiple types of the same dish can be tasty, right? There's never any one right answer. Another question we have here: how to make a call from Salesforce to my desktop Java application? I'm not sure I read that right, but I'm going to assume you want to call Salesforce from your desktop Java application. And you can do that using some of the similar mechanisms that Vasu basically showed today. Essentially, he had the code running on his desktop, which basically called the Salesforce API. So Vasu, if you had to write a client, how would you go about doing it? How would you, if you had to create a client desktop application that needed to talk to Salesforce, what are some of the building blocks you would use?
From a tool standpoint?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, you would use Eclipse or any sort of tool, build, Java builder or IDE. I use Eclipse to actually use my code. So you would use something like Eclipse. You can use any of the other code builders that we have for Java, and then it's the same thing. It doesn't matter because your desktop is you're still communicating over the cloud, over the internet into the cloud for the API calls.
All right. Can Salesforce send messages and integrate with IBM WebSphere MQ series or Sonic MQ? How do we use MQ clients in Salesforce? That's a very good question. Salesforce provides API that are web services enabled, right? So you typically need something in between to translate the information that is coming from Salesforce into something that MQ can understand. And a very important pattern that we have seen a lot of our customers use, and use successfully, if I may add, is the prevalence and the usage of XML security tools. Some of them I can think of as like the Layer 7 technologies has an XML gateway. Then there's a IBM has its own technology called Data Power, and there are many others out there in the market. So one of the interesting patterns we have seen in the past is Salesforce will send a message, which I kind of spoke about, is outbound messaging, and we'll send a message out to this endpoint, and one of the technologies of like either layer 7 or data power will basically take that message, translate that into its appropriate MQ equivalent, and then drop it on a queue either for IBM WebSphere MQSI or some other integration platform to basically read and understand. So I believe we will have time for one more question. There's a question here that the folks put up. It says, are these APIs real-time or near real-time? These APIs are all push and pull, as in they are synchronous. You can essentially go ahead and call the API and get a response back from the API. And so from that standpoint, it's synchronous. There are some other options that are asynchronous, and we will address them in a later webinar. So with that, brings us to a conclusion, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our organizers. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you again soon on a Force.com developer webinar.